Somewhere in the Pacific, people imagined a continent that should not exist. It appeared in old maps, occult books, island rumors, and later, in the strange glow of internet mythology. A drowned world. A motherland. A vanished civilization swallowed so completely that the ocean seemed to keep not only its ruins, but its dead. They called it Lemuria. But from the beginning, the real question was never simply where it had gone. The question was whether Lemuria had ever been there at all, or whether it survived because people needed it to be real. So we begin carefully, not with treasure hunters, not with glowing cities beneath the waves, and not with the promise that some forbidden truth has been hidden from us. Lemuria's story is stranger than that, because it did not begin as fantasy. It began as an explanation, a serious one, at least for its time. Then, slowly, it drifted, across oceans, across bookshelves, across belief. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Tonight, we are following a continent that changed shape every time someone tried to claim it. Scientists used it to solve a puzzle of animals and fossils. Mystics turned it into a lost chapter of human evolution. Nationalists, dreamers, and seekers gave it memory, language, and grief. And beneath all of that is something quieter and perhaps more revealing. A lost world does not need to be real to become powerful. Sometimes, it only needs to answer a longing that the evidence cannot satisfy. Chapter 2. A continent born from lemurs. Long before Lemuria became a drowned empire, long before it was filled with temples, priest-kings, crystal wisdom, or survivors hiding beneath mountains, it began with a much smaller mystery. A furry one. The animal at the center of the story was the lemur. Wide-eyed, nocturnal, almost spectral in its movements, found most famously on Madagascar, that enormous island off the southeastern coast of Africa. To European naturalists in the 19th century, Madagascar was not just remote. It was biologically strange. Its animals seemed to belong to their own private experiment in creation. Some looked African, some seemed distantly connected to forms in Asia, and many appeared nowhere else on Earth. For scientists trying to organize the living world, this was not a minor inconvenience. It was a serious problem. The 19th century loved classification. It loved cabinets, labels, diagrams, family trees, and maps with clean borders. A naturalist could spend a lifetime trying to arrange the confusion of life into a readable pattern. But the more specimens arrived from colonies, expeditions, and museum collections, the more nature resisted being made tidy. Why should Madagascar have such unusual primates? Why should animals related to lemurs appear to connect, at least in the scientific imagination of the time, Madagascar and India? Why did the biological clues seem to point across the Indian Ocean, as though something had once joined lands now separated by water? In 1864, the British zoologist Philip Sclater offered an answer. He proposed that a lost landmass had once stretched across part of the Indian Ocean, linking Madagascar, India, and perhaps other regions nearby. Because the puzzle centered on lemurs, he gave this vanished land a name that sounded almost modest compared with what it would later become. Lemuria. That is the first important correction to make. Lemuria did not begin as an ancient legend preserved by island priests. It did not begin with a secret tablet, a trance vision, or a ruined city glimpsed beneath the surf. It began as a scientific hypothesis, shaped by the tools and assumptions available at the time. And this matters, because it changes the whole tone of the mystery. It is easy, looking backward, to laugh at lost continents as if they were born foolish. But Sclater was not trying to invent a fantasy kingdom. He was trying to solve a real problem in biogeography: why living creatures appear where they do, and how related species become scattered across distant places. The question was legitimate. The answer was wrong. That difference is everything. When Sclater looked at lemurs, he was seeing a pattern. Madagascar had them in abundance. India seemed to offer related clues. Africa, curiously, did not fit as neatly into the picture as one might expect. So Sclater imagined that a land connection had once existed and then disappeared. If there had been a bridge of land across the ocean, animals could have moved across it. Later, if that land sank, the animals would remain like living fragments of a vanished geography. It was a neat solution. Too neat, perhaps, but not irrational for its time. The world before plate tectonics had a different kind of logic. Continents were treated as stable. Oceans were often imagined as ancient basins. If similar animals or fossils appeared in places separated by thousands of miles of water, scholars needed some way to connect them. A sunken land bridge could do the work. It gave movement to species without requiring continents themselves to drift. To modern ears, that may sound like building a bridge because one does not yet understand the road. But science often advances in exactly that way, by creating temporary explanations that later generations dismantle. Sclater's Lemuria was not yet a civilization. It had no temples, no kings, no catastrophic final night, no mystical race meditating under a purple sky. It was, at first, a practical piece of missing terrain, a hypothetical solution placed on the map because the animal evidence seemed to demand it. And yet, even in this early form, one can feel why the idea had power. A vanished land has a peculiar emotional advantage over an ordinary mistake. If a theory says, "We do not yet understand this pattern," it sounds unfinished. If it says, "There was once a continent here, and the sea took it," it becomes a story. It gives absence a shape. It turns a gap in knowledge into a place that can be imagined. That is where Lemuria begins to become dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of a conspiracy, or because Sclater was secretly opening the gate to occult mythology. Dangerous because the name gave people something to hold. Once an idea has a name, it becomes portable. It can travel farther than the evidence that created it. It can be removed from its original context, polished, enlarged, and handed to people who want it to mean something else. But in 1864, the idea was still tied to animals. Think of the scene not as a grand revelation, but as a scholar's problem on a desk. Papers, specimens, maps, and the pressure of making sense of scattered life. The lemur itself becomes almost ironic, a quiet animal, moving through forests at night, lending its name to one of the loudest lost continent myths of the modern world. There is another irony as well. Lemurs did not need a mystical homeland to be fascinating. Their real evolutionary story is extraordinary on its own. Madagascar's isolation allowed life there to develop in distinctive ways over immense stretches of time. But in the 19th century, without the later framework of continental drift, deep oceanic dispersal, and plate movement, that explanation was not yet available in the form we know today. So Lemuria entered the world as a placeholder for missing knowledge. That is not an insult. Many scientific ideas begin as placeholders. They gather observations under one roof until a better structure can be built. The problem comes when the placeholder becomes beloved, when people stop treating it as a tool and begin treating it as a lost inheritance. Sclater's lost land was meant to explain distribution, not destiny. It was about where animals lived, not where humanity began. It belonged to zoology, not prophecy. But the boundary between a scientific proposal and a mythic landscape can be thinner than it appears, especially in an age when evolution, empire, archaeology, and religion were all colliding in public imagination. The name had beauty. The ocean had mystery. The map had an empty space, and the evidence, though incomplete, seemed suggestive enough to invite speculation. That is often how myths with modern clothing are born, not from pure invention, but from an unresolved question that is answered too confidently, too beautifully, and then carried away by people with very different needs. So before Lemuria became a sunken motherland, it was a bridge built from bones, skins, classifications, and uncertainty. It was the shadow of an argument about lemurs, a serious attempt to explain nature before the earth had fully revealed its own machinery. The continent did not rise from ancient memory. It climbed out of a scientific footnote, and once it had a name, it would not stay there. Chapter 3: The Missing Bridge Across the Indian Ocean. To understand why Lemuria once sounded reasonable, you have to step into a world where the earth itself seemed more fixed than it really was. The continents, to many 19th century thinkers, looked like permanent anchors. Africa was Africa. India was India. Madagascar was an island because the map said it was an island. Oceans were vast and ancient separators, not moving scars in the planet's crust. The seafloor was still poorly known, hidden beneath depth, distance, and imagination. There were measurements, yes, and ships had begun to gather more serious data, but the deep ocean remained less like a mapped landscape than a dark interruption. So when naturalists found related animals, plants, or fossils on lands divided by water, they faced a stubborn problem. Life appeared to have crossed gaps that, on the surface, it had no obvious way to cross. Today, we have several answers for this. Continents move. Land masses split. Species drift, raft, migrate, adapt, and vanish. Islands can become laboratories of evolution. Deep time allows unlikely journeys to become possible. But for many scholars in Sclater's age, the strongest available answer was much simpler. There must have been land. Not necessarily a great empire, not necessarily a continent covered with cities, just land enough for animals to travel, plants to spread, and fossils to later look like clues left behind by a missing world. This was the age of the land bridge. A land bridge was a convenient thing. It could appear wherever distribution demanded it. If a species seemed to connect two distant regions, a bridge could be imagined between them. If fossils looked too similar across an ocean, perhaps a strip of land had once joined the continents and then sank. It was not always careless thinking. Often it was an attempt to respect the evidence. The mistake was not that scientists saw patterns. The mistake was that they did not yet understand the scale of the machinery beneath those patterns. The earth was moving, but science had not yet fully learned how to see it move. This is one of the quieter tragedies in the history of ideas. A theory can be wrong not because its question is foolish, but because the right answer belongs to a future instrument, a future map, a future generation. The 19th century had the fossils. It had the animals. It had sharper eyes than many people give it credit for. What it lacked was the full language of plate tectonics. So it built bridges. Across the Indian Ocean, Lemuria became one of those bridges. It gave shape to a proposed connection between Madagascar and India, and perhaps beyond. On paper, it helped solve a biological puzzle. If lemur-like creatures or related forms seemed to sit on opposite sides of the ocean, then a lost landmass could explain the relationship. The animals had not crossed the sea. The sea had arrived later. There is a certain elegance to that idea. You can almost see why it persuaded people. A land bridge makes the world feel legible. It turns scattered facts into a route. It gives the map an invisible past. And maps have always been dangerous when they invite the imagination to complete them. The Indian Ocean of the 19th century mind was not empty, but it was open enough to speculation. Between Africa, Madagascar, India, and the island chains beyond, there was room for vanished ridges, drowned plains, and ancient corridors of migration. The map did not forbid such things with the certainty it would later acquire. The seabed had not yet become the detailed geological record we know now. In that uncertainty, Lemuria could breathe. It is important to pause here, because this is where modern viewers often flatten the story. We tend to divide claims into truth and nonsense, and then assume anything later disproven must always have belonged to nonsense. But the early Lemuria hypothesis lived in a more complicated category. It was wrong, but it was not born from nothing. It was a reasonable-looking answer inside a mistaken model of the Earth. That distinction matters because it helps explain how easily the idea survived. If Lemuria had begun as pure fantasy, scientists might have ignored it, and mystics might have adopted it only as fantasy. But because it carried the scent of scientific respectability, later writers could borrow that authority. They could say, in effect, this was not merely a dream. Scholars had once spoken of it. Naturalists had named it. It had entered the literature. A scientific hypothesis, once abandoned by science, does not always disappear. Sometimes it wanders off and finds a more welcoming home. In the 19th century, the boundaries between emerging science, speculation, religion, and popular imagination were not sealed. Evolution was unsettling older ideas about creation. Fossils were stretching the age of the Earth into almost unimaginable depths. Empires were bringing specimens, stories, and artifacts into European centers of study, often through violent and unequal systems of collection. The public was learning that the world was older, stranger, and less centered on human certainty than it had once appeared. Into that atmosphere came lost lands. They were useful because they softened the shock of distance and deep time. A missing bridge could make the world feel connected again. It could explain why similar creatures appeared in separate places without forcing people to accept every implication of a dynamic, restless planet. It was, in a way, a conservative explanation wearing adventurous clothes. It allowed the map to change in the past while keeping the present continents mostly still. That is the hidden psychology of the land bridge. It says, the world was once arranged more conveniently. It imagines that nature's puzzles are caused by vanished connections, not by the slow violence of moving plates and splitting crust. It offers a lost road instead of a moving Earth. There were, of course, real changes in sea level through geological time. There were real land connections in some places. Beringia, for example, was not a fantasy. Lowered seas did expose land between Siberia and Alaska during Ice Age periods. So the broader idea that geography can change was not absurd. The problem was scale. Lemuria required far more than a temporary coastal plain or exposed shelf. It required a major landmass in the Indian Ocean doing exactly the work the theory needed it to do, then conveniently vanishing. The evidence never truly matched the ambition, but as a 19th century proposal, it had enough plausibility to enter the conversation. It sat at the intersection of real observations and limited explanation. It belonged to an intellectual landscape where absence could be drawn confidently, where a blank under the ocean could be treated as a missing piece rather than a warning. And this is where Lemuria's story begins to widen. A bridge is supposed to connect two places, but once people imagined that bridge, they began to wonder what else might have crossed it. Animals, yes. Plants, perhaps. But what about early humans? What about ancient cultures? What about spiritual ancestors, forgotten migrations, and the origins of civilization? The scientific land bridge had done its work too well. It had connected geography. Soon, others would use it to connect myths, races, and destinies. The missing bridge across the Indian Ocean was no longer just a solution to a zoological puzzle. It was becoming a stage. Chapter 4. When science opened the door to myth. The strange thing about Lemuria is that it did not need temples to become mythic. At first, it only needed permission. A name had been placed on the map of possibility. A serious scholar had suggested that a lost landmass might explain the distribution of animals. Other scientists were already comfortable imagining vanished bridges across oceans. The idea was not proven, but it had enough academic weight to be repeated, debated, and adapted. That was all it took for Lemuria to begin slipping out of zoology and into a much larger dream. Because the 19th century was not only asking where animals came from, it was asking where human beings came from. Few questions carried more tension. The publication of Darwin's work had unsettled old certainties. Human origins were no longer safely wrapped in familiar religious timelines. The age of the Earth had expanded beyond ordinary imagination. Fossils suggested vanished worlds before human memory. Comparative anatomy placed human bodies uncomfortably close to other primates. Science was not simply adding new facts. It was rearranging the human place in the universe. And into that rearrangement stepped Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel was a German biologist, a passionate defender and popularizer of evolutionary ideas, and a man whose imagination often ran ahead of the evidence. He was brilliant, influential, and deeply controversial. He had a gift for turning scientific concepts into grand visual and philosophical systems. He liked genealogies, diagrams, sweeping lines of development. He wanted life to have a readable architecture. For someone like Haeckel, a lost land such as Lemuria was not merely a zoological convenience. It could become a stage on which the early drama of humanity might have unfolded. He speculated that a now vanished land in the region of the Indian Ocean could have played a role in human origins. In some versions of this thinking, Lemuria helped explain where ancestral human forms might have lived before spreading into other parts of the world. This was not archaeology. It was not a conclusion drawn from cities, tools, bones, or inscriptions found beneath the sea. It was an attempt to fill a gap in evolutionary geography at a time when the fossil record of early humanity was painfully incomplete. That incompleteness is essential. A missing fossil is more than an empty space in a museum drawer. It can become an invitation. When scientists do not yet possess the evidence they need, they sometimes imagine where it might be waiting. In the 19th century, the missing link was not just a scientific phrase, it was a cultural obsession. Newspapers, lecturers, theologians, and skeptics all circled the idea that somewhere, somehow, there had to be evidence connecting humans to deeper animal ancestry. A vanished continent offered a convenient hiding place. If the fossils had not been found, perhaps the land that held them had sunk. If the human family tree looked incomplete, perhaps one of its most important branches lay beneath the ocean. The lost land did not merely explain absence, it protected absence from becoming a problem. That is where Lemuria changed meaning. In Sclater's hands, it answered a question about lemurs. In Haeckel's world, it could answer a question about ourselves. The subject moved from animal distribution to human destiny. And once that shift occurred, the emotional temperature of the idea rose sharply. People can be interested in a lost land bridge for animals, but a lost birthplace of humanity is something else entirely. It has weight, it has intimacy, it touches ancestry, identity, even salvation, and for those trying to reconcile science and spirituality. A continent that explains lemurs may belong in a journal. A continent that explains mankind belongs in the imagination. This does not mean Haeckel invented the later occult Lemuria. He did not build the whole myth. He did not supply the elaborate mystical races, hidden masters, or secret histories that would come later. But thinkers like him widened the doorway. They showed that Lemuria could be more than a geological convenience. It could be made to carry human meaning. And here, the story becomes more delicate. The 19th century's search for human origins was entangled with ideas that today require caution. Many European scholars tried to classify humanity into ranked racial categories, often with assumptions shaped by colonial power, prejudice, and the belief that some peoples represented earlier stages of development. Evolutionary language was sometimes misused to justify hierarchies that were social and political, not scientific facts. Lemuria entered that atmosphere, and it could not remain untouched by it. A hypothetical landmass became useful because it allowed writers to imagine ancient migrations, lost populations, and developmental stages of humanity without hard evidence. It gave speculation a geography. It turned theory into scenery. This is one of the most important lessons in the whole Lemurian story. An idea does not have to be false in every part to become dangerous in its later uses. The original biological puzzle was real. The land bridge hypothesis was wrong, but understandable. Haeckel's evolutionary questions were part of a genuine scientific revolution. Yet when these pieces were combined with incomplete evidence and cultural prejudice, Lemuria began to gather meanings it could not support. It became a container. Into it, different writers poured their anxieties and desires, the search for origins, the fear that humanity was not special, the hope that some ancient homeland would make the chaos of prehistory feel orderly. Lemuria was useful precisely because it was missing. A visible continent would have resisted invention. It would have had borders, rocks, ruins, weather, inconvenient details. A sunken continent could be almost anything. That is why the move from science to myth did not happen in a single dramatic leap. It happened through small acts of enlargement. A zoological hypothesis became a geographical possibility. A geographical possibility became a potential cradle of early humanity. A potential cradle became a place where writers could imagine lost peoples. Once imagined peoples entered the story, civilization was not far behind. No one had to discover a city. They only had to ask whether one might have existed. The evidence was thin, but the narrative was strong. And strong narratives often survive the failure of their evidence longer than anyone expects. By the late 19th century, Lemuria had acquired a peculiar double life. Among serious scientists, it remained a speculative tool, increasingly vulnerable as geology and biology advanced. In the wider imagination, however, it had become richer. It was no longer just a bridge between Madagascar and India. It had begun to feel like a missing chapter in the human story. That transformation reveals something uncomfortable about the border between knowledge and longing. Science can open a door by naming a possibility. Myth can walk through that door and furnish the room. Lemuria had not yet become the shadow continent of occult prehistory. Not fully. But it had been moved into position. It had been given a name, an ocean, a biological puzzle, and now a human purpose. The land bridge was beginning to dream. Chapter 5. Blavatsky's Shadow Continent. By the time Lemuria entered the occult imagination, it had already learned how to survive without evidence. That may sound unfair, but it is the key to its next transformation. A scientific idea can be disproven and still leave behind a useful shape. Lemuria had a name. It had an oceanic emptiness around it. It had once been spoken of by naturalists and evolutionary thinkers. It had just enough intellectual residue to feel more solid than a dream, and just enough uncertainty to be filled with almost anything. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky understood the power of such spaces. Blavatsky was one of the central figures of Theosophy, a 19th century spiritual movement that attempted to combine elements of Eastern religion, Western esotericism, occult philosophy, and evolutionary language into a sweeping account of cosmic and human development. It was ambitious, strange, often contradictory, and enormously influential in the hidden currents of modern spirituality. Theosophy did not simply ask where human beings came from in the biological sense. It asked where consciousness came from, where the soul had traveled, whether humanity was moving through stages of spiritual evolution across vast cycles of time. For that kind of vision, ordinary history was much too small. It needed lost continents. In Blavatsky's writings, Lemuria was no longer a cautious scientific proposal about animal distribution. It became part of an immense sacred prehistory, populated not by lemurs, but by ancestral forms of humanity. The language she used belonged to the theosophical idea of root races, a concept that imagined humanity passing through successive stages of physical and spiritual development. That phrase should make a modern listener uneasy. It carries the heavy baggage of 19th century racial thinking, and later esoteric writers often treated human difference through hierarchies that were not only unsupported, but morally dangerous. Theosophy did not invent all of those ideas from nothing. It absorbed them from the intellectual atmosphere around it. An atmosphere shaped by empire, pseudo-scientific racial classification, and the desire to rank cultures on a ladder of supposed advancement. So when we speak of Blavatsky's Lemuria, we are not entering a harmless fairy tale. We are entering a symbolic world built from mystical longing, borrowed science, and the prejudices of its age. Yet it is also too simple to dismiss the whole thing as mere nonsense scribbled in candlelight. That would miss why it mattered. Blavatsky's genius, if we can use that word carefully, was not that she proved anything. She did not. Her genius was narrative architecture. She took scattered pieces of science, religion, myth, and speculation, then arranged them into a vast, hidden history. In that hidden history, Lemuria became a missing act in the drama of the human soul. The continent was useful because it gave spiritual evolution a landscape. A purely invisible doctrine can be difficult to imagine, but place it on a vanished continent, and it begins to feel almost historical. Give it ancient races, catastrophes, and cycles of rise and fall, and the doctrine becomes a memory of something that might have happened before recorded time. Not proven, not even likely, but narratively powerful. That is the strange alchemy of occult history. It turns absence into authority. If no ruins are found, that can be explained away by the sinking of the land. If no records survive, perhaps they were preserved only by initiates. If ordinary geology objects, then ordinary geology is said to be blind to spiritual truth. The claim becomes protected by the very lack of evidence that should weaken it. This is where Lemuria crossed a line. Sclater's version could be tested against animal distribution and geology. It could be debated, revised, or abandoned. Blavatsky's version lived in another register. It was not really vulnerable to the same kind of correction, because its main evidence was not physical. It depended on esoteric tradition, claimed hidden knowledge, and spiritual authority. For believers, that made it deeper than science. For skeptics, it made it impossible to verify. And for the myth itself, it made Lemuria nearly indestructible. The continent no longer had to sit exactly between Madagascar and India. It no longer had to obey the needs of zoology. It could expand through symbolic time. It could become a place where humanity was not merely born, but shaped. Not merely evolved, but initiated. The land that once existed to explain lemurs had become a theater for spiritual ancestry. This movement tells us something important about the late 19th century. Many people were not satisfied with a world explained only by mechanism. Evolution had made life older and more connected, but to some minds it had also made existence feel colder. Theosophy offered a counter-story. Yes, humanity evolves, but not blindly. There are stages, purposes, hidden teachers, forgotten wisdom, and worlds lost beneath the surface of ordinary history. Lemuria fit beautifully into that hunger. It offered deep time without emptiness, catastrophe without meaninglessness, prehistory with a secret design. That does not make it true. It explains why it was attractive. People often imagine pseudo-history as a failure of intelligence, but more often it is a failure of restraint. The mind sees a gap and cannot resist decorating it. It takes a scientific uncertainty and asks it to carry emotional weight. It takes a vanished land bridge and turns it into a homeland for the soul. Blavatsky's Lemuria was not discovered. It was interpreted into existence. And once that happened, later writers had a model they could imitate. A lost continent did not need to be supported by archaeology if it could be supported by revelation. It did not need visible ruins if it could be presented as a forgotten layer of human consciousness. The sea became less an obstacle than a curtain. Behind it, anything could be placed. Still, there is a sadness in the story. The real history of humanity is already vast enough to humble anyone. Our ancestors crossed deserts, coastlines, forests, and ice. They made tools, buried their dead, painted animals on stone, learned fire, language, migration, memory. No shadow continent is needed to make that story sacred. But Lemuria promised something different. It promised that our origins were not merely difficult to reconstruct, but deliberately hidden. It promised that the missing pieces were grander than the pieces we had. It gave mystery the shape of inheritance. That promise is hard to surrender. By the time Theosophy was finished with Lemuria, the old scientific hypothesis had become almost unrecognizable. The lemurs were gone. The cautious biogeography was gone. What remained was a shadow continent, drifting through occult prehistory, carrying the weight of spiritual evolution, racial mythology, and the longing for a forgotten golden age. It had crossed from map to myth, and myths, once they learn to speak in the language of destiny, are very difficult to drown. Chapter 6. The Continent That Changed Oceans. Lemuria began in the Indian Ocean, with Madagascar on one side of the puzzle and India on the other. That should have kept it there. A scientific hypothesis, even a mistaken one, usually has a kind of address. It belongs to a problem, a map, a set of evidence. Sclater's Lemuria had been named for lemurs, and the lemur problem was not a Pacific problem. It was tied to Madagascar, India, and the question of how animals had come to live where they did. But myths are not loyal to their birthplace. Once Lemuria escaped from zoology and entered occult history, it became less a location than a vessel. It could carry whatever later writers needed it to carry. Lost races, spiritual evolution, forgotten wisdom, vanished homelands. And when an idea becomes symbolic enough, geography starts to loosen. The continent no longer has to remain where the original argument placed it. It drifts toward stronger desires. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Pacific had become an especially tempting ocean for lost continent fantasies. It was enormous. It held thousands of islands scattered across distances that seemed almost impossible to the European imagination. It contained cultures with deep voyaging traditions, languages that showed relationships across water, monumental ruins in some places, and oral histories that outsiders often misunderstood or reshaped to fit their own expectations. To people who did not understand Pacific navigation, the ocean looked like a riddle. How had human beings reached such remote islands? How were distant cultures connected? Why did certain myths seem to outsiders to echo one another? The correct answers involve real human brilliance. Navigation by stars, winds, currents, birds, wave patterns, and generations of maritime knowledge. Pacific peoples did not need a vanished continent to explain their presence. They crossed the ocean because they knew how to cross it. But outsiders often preferred a different answer. Instead of recognizing the full achievement of island navigators, some writers imagined that the islands were merely the surviving mountaintops of a drowned land. The people living there became, in these stories, remnants of something older and grander. Their cultures were treated not as living civilizations with their own histories, but as fragments of a lost world waiting to be interpreted by someone else. This is one of the quiet violences hidden inside many lost continent myths. They appear to honor ancient peoples, but often they replace those peoples' real achievements with an invented civilization that belongs more to the writer's imagination than to the communities being described. Into this atmosphere came Mu. The name had its own tangled history, but it became famous through writers who claimed that a vast mother civilization had once existed in the Pacific before sinking beneath the sea. The most influential of them was James Churchward, an English-born writer whose books in the early 20th century presented Mu as the original homeland of humanity, a great Pacific continent destroyed by catastrophe. Here, Lemuria and Mu began to blur. They were not originally the same idea. Lemuria came from a 19th century biological hypothesis about the Indian Ocean. Mu grew into a Pacific lost civilization story through a different stream of speculation. But popular imagination is not careful about footnotes. Two drowned lands are easily mistaken for one another, especially when both promise ancient wisdom, forgotten origins, and ruins swallowed by water. So Lemuria, the land of lemurs, was gradually pulled across the map. It became associated with the Pacific. It merged with stories of Mu. It appeared in esoteric writings as a vast, drowned continent, where ancient beings lived, evolved, suffered catastrophe, or left survivors behind. A concept born from animal distribution had become part of a new mythology of the Pacific, one that had almost nothing to do with its scientific origin. The transformation is revealing. When people imagine a lost continent, they are rarely imagining geology first. They are imagining a missing center, a place from which scattered cultures, symbols, and mysteries might all be explained. The Pacific, with its great distances and island worlds, seemed to invite that kind of central fantasy. Instead of many histories, many voyages, many languages, many local developments, the lost continent offered one dramatic source, one motherland, one catastrophe, one answer. That is the seduction of Mu and of the Pacific Lemuria that grew beside it. It simplified the ocean. But the Pacific is not simple. It is not a broken continent with a few surviving pieces. It is a living historical world shaped by migration, adaptation, trade, memory, isolation, and contact. Its islands are not clues waiting to be solved by a vanished empire. They are places with their own depth. Churchward's version of Mu ignored that complexity. It treated the Pacific as the grave of a universal civilization, a stage for a story so large that real evidence became almost secondary. The ocean was made theatrical. Islands became relics. Myths became coded memories. Archaeology was pushed into the role of decoration whenever it seemed useful, and dismissed whenever it did not. Lemuria changed in the same way. The old Indian Ocean hypothesis had at least been attached to a specific scientific problem. The Pacific Lemuria was freer, but that freedom came at a cost. It could no longer be pinned down. It was sometimes a continent, sometimes a civilization, sometimes a spiritual age, sometimes a race of beings, sometimes a memory of Mu under another name. The more meanings it collected, the less evidence it required. And the less evidence it required, the more confidently it could be retold. There is an almost comic absurdity here, if one steps back far enough. A land invented to explain lemurs somehow ends up in the Pacific, explaining humanity, Atlantis-like catastrophes, island ruins, ancient wisdom, and the supposed origin of civilization. The lemurs themselves have vanished from their own continent's afterlife. But the absurdity should not make us miss the pattern. Lemuria survived because it was adaptable. It could attach itself to whatever mystery was fashionable. When the problem was animal distribution, it became a land bridge. When the problem was human origins, it became an ancestral cradle. When the hunger was spiritual, it became an occult homeland. When the Pacific became a canvas for speculation, Lemuria crossed the world and found new water to drown in. That adaptability is why lost continents are so difficult to kill. They do not behave like ordinary claims. An ordinary claim fails when its evidence fails. A mythic claim mutates. It changes oceans, changes names, changes purpose, and tells its followers that the deeper truth has only been misunderstood. By the time Lemuria became entangled with Mu, it was no longer really Sclater's idea at all. It had become a shared costume worn by several fantasies at once. The Indian Ocean origin remained like a faint stain beneath later layers, but the image most people inherited was Pacific. Vast blue water, scattered islands, a drowned civilization, and the promise that somewhere below the waves lay the first home of humankind. That promise was powerful. It was also unsupported. And yet, for many readers, support was no longer the point. The Pacific Lemuria offered a feeling that the world had lost something magnificent, and that modern life was only the surviving shoreline of a much older human story. The continent had not been found. It had been relocated by imagination. Chapter 7. Mu, the Motherland of Men. James Churchward did not present Mu as a possibility. He presented it as a revelation. In his telling, the Pacific had once held a vast motherland, a great civilization older than Egypt, older than India, older than the familiar ancient world. Mu was not merely another Atlantis, not merely a sunken kingdom with a tragic end. It was, in Churchward's imagination, the beginning point, the original home from which civilization, religion, symbols, and human wisdom had spread across the globe. It was an intoxicating claim, and like many intoxicating claims, it arrived with props. Churchward wrote of ancient tablets, secret knowledge, buried records, and symbols that supposedly preserved the memory of this Pacific homeland. He suggested that he had been shown materials in India by a priest, and that these records helped reveal the history of Mu. Later, he connected his claims to ruins, inscriptions, myths, and motifs from far-flung cultures, treating them as fragments of a single lost system. To a reader already inclined toward mystery, the method could feel persuasive. A symbol here, a flood story there, a pyramid somewhere else, a word that resembles another word if handled gently enough. Piece by piece, the world appears to be whispering the same secret. But that is also the danger. When a writer begins with a conclusion and then gathers similarities to support it, almost anything can become evidence. Human cultures often create similar shapes, stories, and sacred patterns for reasons that do not require a vanished super-civilization. People everywhere watch the sun rise. They fear floods. They bury the dead. They build upward when they want to honor the sky or display power. They use circles, crosses, spirals, animals, stars, mountains, and water because these belong to shared human experience. Similarity is not the same as dissent. Churchward's Mu depended heavily on treating resemblance as proof. If two distant cultures shared a symbol, he often interpreted that as a surviving trace of the lost motherland. If a myth spoke of catastrophe, it became a memory of Mu's destruction. If ruins appeared impressive or difficult to explain, they were folded into the same story. The result was not careful archaeology. It was a kind of narrative magnetism. Everything mysterious was pulled toward the center, and the center was always Mu. In Churchward's story, the end came through catastrophe. The continent sank beneath the Pacific, destroyed by geological convulsion, leaving only islands and scattered survivors. These survivors, supposedly, carried Mu's wisdom outward into the ancient world. Civilizations that scholars studied as separate developments became, in this version, descendants of a single drowned source. This is where the story becomes emotionally powerful. Mu offers a clean answer to a messy world. It says that humanity once had a shared beginning, a lost unity, perhaps even a higher wisdom, and that the confusion of later history is a kind of exile from that original home. The ocean becomes not just a grave, but a wound. That feeling explains why the idea found readers. But feeling does not make a continent real. Archaeology has not supported Churchward's claims. Geology has not supported the existence of a recently sunken Pacific supercontinent. The Pacific seafloor does not preserve the shape of a drowned continental empire waiting to be rediscovered, and the alleged tablets and records at the heart of Churchward's narrative have never stood as credible evidence in the way he needed them to. The problem is not simply that one detail is weak. The whole structure leans on methods that serious scholarship cannot accept. A real lost civilization leaves traces, not always spectacular ones and not always easy to interpret, but traces, tools, settlements, bones, trade goods, pottery, hearths, inscriptions if writing existed, agricultural remains, genetic signals, layers in the ground that can be dated and compared. Even when sea levels rise and coastlines drown, archaeology does not become pure guesswork. It becomes difficult, yes, but not magical. Churchward's Mu asks us to accept a civilization of almost impossible scale whose physical evidence somehow disappears while its supposed influence appears everywhere in symbolic fragments. That is backwards. The claim is enormous, but the evidence is evasive. There is a pattern here familiar in pseudo-history. The missing proof is treated not as a weakness, but as part of the romance. The ruins are gone because the continent sank. The records are hidden, lost, suppressed, mistranslated, or known only through special access. The absence becomes atmospheric. It makes the story feel deeper when it should make us more cautious. This does not mean every person attracted to Mu was foolish. Many were responding to real questions. How did ancient peoples migrate? Why do flood stories appear in many places? Why do humans build monuments? Why do civilizations rise in different parts of the world with surprising sophistication? Those are fair questions. The trouble begins when the answer erases the complexity of the people being studied. Mu makes ancient cultures less themselves. Egypt becomes a recipient. Mesoamerica becomes a clue. Pacific Islanders become remnants. India becomes a storage room for hidden tablets. Local histories are flattened into evidence for someone else's master story. The lost continent swallows the living world almost as completely as the sea supposedly swallowed Mu. That is why it matters to call Churchward's claims pseudoscience rather than merely alternative history. The issue is not that he asked unusual questions. It is that his answers bypassed the discipline required to test them. He selected evidence loosely, treated speculation as memory, and built a universal origin story without the archaeological and geological foundation such a claim would demand. There is also a deeper irony. Churchward wanted to restore a lost grandeur to human history, but in doing so, he underestimated humanity's real grandeur. The spread of people across the Pacific did not require a drowned continent. It required courage, observation, inherited maritime skill, and generations of navigators who could read the ocean with a precision outsiders failed to appreciate. The rise of separate civilizations did not require a single motherland. It required human communities, in many places, solving difficult problems in their own environments. The real story is less tidy than Mu. It is also more impressive. But lost motherlands have a seductive simplicity. They gather the scattered achievements of humanity into one vanished source and say, "Here, this is where it all began." For a modern world fragmented by borders, languages, and broken memory, that promise can feel almost comforting. Churchward gave that comfort a name, a map, and a catastrophe. He did not give it proof. And yet, through Mu, Lemuria's afterlife became even stranger. The old land of lemurs had now fused with the Pacific motherland of men. A biological hypothesis had become a universal prehistory. A missing bridge had become the cradle of civilization. The ocean was no longer hiding an explanation for animal distribution. It was hiding the first chapter of humanity itself. That is a remarkable transformation. It is also a warning. The larger a lost world theory becomes, the more it must ignore. It must ignore the seabed. It must ignore the slow work of archaeology. It must ignore the independent genius of ancient peoples. It must ignore the possibility that history is not a single buried secret, but a vast number of human stories unfolding at once. Mu survives because it is beautiful. It fails because beauty is not evidence, and somewhere in that gap, between the story people wanted and the world the evidence allows, Lemuria found yet another life. Chapter 8. Mount Shasta and the Survivors. Beneath the mountain, by the time Lemuria reached Mount Shasta, it had almost completely left the ocean behind. This is one of the strangest turns in the story. A continent first imagined as a land bridge in the Indian Ocean, then enlarged into a Pacific motherland, somehow became attached to a snow-crowned volcano in Northern California. The drowned world did not simply sink, it migrated inland. Its survivors, according to later esoteric folklore, were no longer scattered island remnants or ancient teachers lost to the sea. They were hidden beings living beneath a mountain. Mount Shasta already had the right kind of presence for legend. It rises with a startling isolation, a white volcanic mass above forests and high country, visible from long distances when the air is clear. Even without myth, it has the authority of a place that seems to stand apart. Mountains often gather stories because they interrupt the ordinary horizon. They look like thresholds. They make the sky feel closer and the ground feel less settled. Long before modern occult seekers arrived, the mountain held deep significance for indigenous peoples of the region. Those traditions are not the same as the later Lemurian stories, and they should not be treated as interchangeable decoration. One of the common mistakes in esoteric folklore is to take a sacred place, strip it of its living cultural context, and then use it as a stage for imported fantasies. The Lemurian Mount Shasta myth belongs mostly to that later world. In the early 20th century, California became fertile ground for new spiritual movements, occult experiments, alternative religions, and visionary literature. The American West already carried a mythology of reinvention. People came looking for health, revelation, freedom, or a new beginning with better weather. Into that atmosphere, Mount Shasta became more than a mountain. It became a screen. Writers and seekers began associating it with hidden masters, ancient survivors, underground cities, and beings who had escaped the destruction of Lemuria. Later, New Age traditions would speak of a hidden city beneath the mountain, sometimes called Telos, where enlightened Lemurians supposedly continued to live in secrecy. These stories vary from teller to teller, as such stories usually do. Some describe luminous beings. Others imagine advanced technology, spiritual teachings, tunnels, crystals, or a society waiting for humanity to become ready. What matters is not the consistency of the details. What matters is the transformation. The lost continent was no longer being sought under the Pacific. It had become a hidden interior world. Lemuria had changed from geography into refuge. The sea had destroyed the homeland, but the mountain preserved its chosen survivors. That change reveals a great deal about the myth's emotional life. A drowned continent is tragic, but distant. It belongs to the unreachable past. A hidden community beneath a mountain feels closer. It suggests that the lost world is not entirely lost. Someone survived. Someone remembers. Someone may still be watching. This is a very different kind of mystery. Churchward's Moo ask the reader to imagine a vanished motherland whose influence spread through ancient civilizations. The Mount Shasta legends ask the believer to imagine contact. Not merely ruins, not merely memory, but presence. The hidden beings are near enough to encounter, yet safely beyond verification. They live beneath stone, behind veils, in tunnels no one can reliably produce, in a realm that sounds physical when described and spiritual when challenged. That flexibility is powerful. If the beings are not seen, they are hidden. If no city is found, it exists on a higher vibration, or in a sealed subterranean domain, or in a dimension adjacent to ordinary perception. The claim moves whenever evidence approaches it. Like many esoteric legends, it survives by refusing to remain fully material. And still, people are drawn to it. It is easy to understand why. Mount Shasta offers a myth of survival rather than extinction. The ocean in the older Lemurian stories is a devourer. It takes the continent, the people, the evidence, the dead. The mountain reverses that symbolism. It protects, it shelters, it keeps a secret alive under snow and rock. There is also something deeply modern about placing ancient wisdom underground. In an age of industry, war, urban loneliness, and spiritual uncertainty, the idea of a hidden, wiser civilization can feel like a rebuke to the surface world. The surface is noisy, divided, forgetful. Beneath it, the myth says, there is order, continuity, patience. A people who did not lose the knowledge we lost. This is not archaeology. It is longing with architecture. That does not mean the mountain is empty of meaning. Places can be meaningful without proving every story told about them. Mount Shasta is geologically real, culturally significant, visually extraordinary, and spiritually important to many people for many different reasons. The problem begins when later legends claim factual authority they do not possess, especially when they borrow the prestige of indigenous sacred geography while replacing indigenous voices with imported occult narratives. The Lemurian survivors of Mount Shasta are not supported by credible geological or archaeological evidence. There is no verified underground Lemurian city beneath the mountain. No established record of an ancient Pacific civilization escaping into tunnels there. No physical remains that would connect the mountain to a lost supercontinent. But myths do not always need proof to shape behavior. People travel to Mount Shasta because of these stories. They meditate there, search there, write about it, sell books about it, and sometimes report experiences that feel personally transformative. For them, the mountain becomes a meeting place between landscape and expectation. The story changes how the place is seen. That is one of the more subtle powers of Lemuria. It does not merely describe imaginary geography. It teaches people how to look at real geography. A peak becomes an entrance. A cloud becomes a sign. A cave becomes a possible doorway. A silence in the forest becomes charged with intention. The myth overlays the physical world like a second map, one that cannot be folded away simply because the first map is more accurate. From a historian's perspective, Mount Shasta shows how far Lemuria had traveled from its origin. The name that once belonged to a proposed solution for lemur distribution had become part of American esoteric folklore. It no longer needed Madagascar. It no longer needed India. It barely needed the Pacific. The important thing was not where Lemuria had been, but who might have survived it. And that survival story gave the myth a human face. A drowned continent is an absence. Survivors are a promise. They suggest that ancient catastrophe did not end the story. They keep the door open to contact, revelation, rescue, or return. They allow believers to imagine that somewhere beneath the ordinary world, a better version of humanity endured. That may be the real reason Mount Shasta became such a natural home for the legend. A mountain is both visible and inaccessible. You can point to it. You can climb part of it. You can photograph it, visit it, feel its weather on your skin, and yet, its interior remains hidden. It gives the myth a body without surrendering its mystery. Lemuria had once been under the waves. Now it was underfoot. Chapter 9. Kumari Kandam and the Politics of a Lost Homeland. Not every lost land that touched Lemuria came from the same hunger. Some were born from occult speculation. Some from pseudo-scientific attempts to explain ruins, symbols, or human origins. But Kumari Kandam belongs to a more complicated landscape, because it is tied not only to fantasy, but to language, colonial scholarship, cultural memory, and the emotional force of Homeland. In Tamil tradition, there are old literary memories of lands lost to the sea. These memories do not map neatly onto the modern Lemurian myth, and they should not be treated as if they were simply the same story wearing a different name. The traditions around submerged southern lands have their own history, their own cultural texture, and their own importance within Tamil thought. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, something happened. The Western idea of Lemuria, already detached from its scientific origin, was drawn into Tamil discussions of antiquity. A hypothetical land once imagined to explain lemurs between Madagascar and India became linked with the idea of a submerged Tamil homeland south of the Indian subcontinent. In this new setting, Lemuria was not merely a lost continent. It became a possible cradle of Tamil civilization. This is where the story becomes politically charged. For communities living under colonial rule, history was never just the past. It was dignity. It was proof of depth. It was a way to answer the quiet violence of being told that your culture was secondary, derivative, or waiting to be interpreted by someone else. Colonial scholarship often classified, ranked, and explained cultures through European assumptions. Sometimes it preserved valuable material. Sometimes it distorted what it touched. Tamil intellectuals and revivalists, working in that atmosphere, were not simply inventing pride out of nothing. They were responding to a world that had made antiquity a form of authority. If a people could claim an ancient language, an ancient literature, an ancient homeland, then they could claim a place in world history that colonial narratives could not easily dismiss. Kumari Kandam, especially when fused with Lemuria, offered a powerful image, a lost southern land where Tamil civilization had flourished before catastrophe, before dispersal, before later histories obscured its greatness. That image carried grief and grandeur at once. A homeland beneath the sea is different from a homeland on a map. A mapped homeland can be invaded, taxed, administered, renamed. A drowned homeland cannot be conquered in the same way. It is unreachable, and that makes it strangely pure. It exists beyond ordinary politics, while still feeding political memory. No empire can occupy it. No archaeologist can easily disprove every feeling attached to it. It becomes a place of origin protected by loss. This does not mean the grandest claims about Kumari Kandam are supported by geology or archaeology. They are not. There is no credible evidence for a vast, ancient Tamil continent stretching across the Southern Ocean in the way later Lemurian-influenced accounts sometimes describe. The Indian Ocean did not recently swallow a massive civilized landmass that explains the origins of Tamil culture. Sea levels have changed. Coastlines have shifted. Local lands can be lost to the sea. But that is very different from the disappearance of an enormous continent with an advanced civilization. The distinction matters. Real coastal loss can become remembered in story. Floods happen. Shorelines move. Settlements can disappear. Communities can carry memories of environmental change long after the physical traces are difficult to recover. But a memory of the sea-taking land does not automatically prove a sunken supercontinent. Between those two ideas lies a vast distance, and mythology often crosses that distance faster than evidence can follow. Kumari Kandam shows how that crossing can happen. A poetic memory becomes a historical proposal. A historical proposal is strengthened by a scientific-sounding name. Lemuria supplies that name. Colonial-era theories supply a framework. Cultural revival supplies emotional urgency. Soon the drowned land is no longer only a story about what was lost. It becomes a statement about who a people are. And that is why treating Kumari Kandam as merely another lost continent myth feels too crude. For some, it became a way to imagine Tamil antiquity as deeper than competing histories. For others, it became a symbol of cultural survival after erasure. For still others, it became part of nationalist or regional identity, a lost motherland whose disappearance explained dispersion, linguistic greatness, and civilizational pride. The evidence may not support the continent, but the attachment to it reveals a real historical wound. People rarely fight over imaginary geography unless something real is at stake. Here, what is at stake is memory. Who owns it, who interprets it, and who gets to decide which pasts are considered respectable. Western scholars once gave Lemuria a scientific name and then abandoned it when better geology arrived. But once the name entered cultural politics, it did not vanish so easily. It had become useful in a different way. Science could say, the continent was not there. Identity could answer, the loss still means something. Those are not the same kind of claim, and confusing them leads to bad history. The careful path is to hold both truths without flattening either one. Kumari Kandam, as a vast Lemurian continent, is not supported by modern geology, but the longing attached to it is historically real. The literary memories, the revivalist uses, the colonial context, and the emotional power of a submerged homeland all deserve attention. This is where Lemuria becomes more than a mistaken hypothesis or an occult stage set. It becomes a mirror for how communities use the past when the present has wounded them. A lost continent can be a fantasy. It can also be a protest. Not a proof, but a protest against being told that one's origins are small. That does not mean we should accept every grand claim made in its name. Respect is not the same as agreement. In fact, taking a tradition seriously requires being honest about what the evidence can bear. When every symbol is forced into literal history, the tradition can become less rich, not more. A poetic sea can hold meanings that a fake continent cannot. And perhaps that is the more interesting truth. Kumari Kandam endures because it stands at the meeting point of geology and grief, scholarship and pride, memory and imagination. It shows how a scientific mistake from Europe could be absorbed into a very different cultural world and transformed into a story of belonging. It also reminds us that myths do not spread only because people are careless. Sometimes they spread because they answer a question that official history failed to answer tenderly. Where did we come from? What did we lose? Who were we before others named us? Lemuria could not answer those questions with evidence. But for many, Kumari Kandam answered them with feeling. And feeling, when tied to Homeland, can outlive almost any correction printed in a geology textbook. Chapter 10. The Evidence That Was Never There. By now, Lemuria had become many things at once. A bridge for animals, a cradle for humanity, a spiritual stage, a Pacific motherland, a hidden refuge beneath a mountain, a drowned homeland folded into memory and identity. Every version carried a different emotional charge, and each one solved a different problem for the people who believed in it. But eventually, every lost continent has to face the same cold question. What did it leave behind? Not in dreams, not in symbols, not in books written centuries after the supposed catastrophe. What did it leave in the ground, in the seafloor, in the rocks, in the measurable history of the earth? For Lemuria, in its grandest forms, the answer is almost nothing. That is not the same as saying the story has no history. It has a rich history as an idea, but as a physical civilization, a vast drowned empire in the Pacific, or a recent sunken continent in the Indian Ocean, or an advanced ancestral motherland whose survivors shaped the world, the evidence does not appear where it should. And for a claim this large, absence matters. A small village can vanish almost completely. A coastal settlement can be swallowed by rising seas, buried under silt, or destroyed by erosion. A wooden culture may leave fewer traces than one that built in stone. Archaeologists know this well. The past is unevenly preserved, and humility is necessary. But Lemuria is not usually claimed as a small village. The versions that captured the imagination speak of continents, civilizations, ancient races, global influence, and catastrophic destruction on a scale that would have left enormous marks. A landmass that large does not quietly disappear from geology. A civilization that influential does not vanish from archaeology without leaving patterns that can be tested. A recent continent sinking beneath an ocean would disturb the record in ways far greater than a rumor. This is where the myth begins to strain. If there had been a large Pacific supercontinent in the recent human past, the ocean floor should tell us. It does not. The Pacific is not a hidden graveyard of a vanished continental empire. Its geology is active, complex, and fascinating, but not in the way the Lemurian or Mu legends require. Oceanic crust forms, moves, sinks, and is recycled, Continents behave differently. They are not simply trap doors that open beneath civilizations and close without a trace. The Indian Ocean has its own complexities, including fragments of continental crust and ancient geological histories. But those realities do not rescue the old Lemurian myth either. A submerged fragment of crust is not the same thing as a lost civilization. A microcontinent is not automatically a memory of priests, tablets, or spiritual races. Geology can be stranger than legend, but it is also more disciplined. It does not become whatever the story needs. The archaeological problem is just as severe. A vast Lemurian civilization would have required people, tools, food systems, settlements, movement, trade, and material culture. Even if much were drowned, traces should remain somewhere. On surviving islands, coastal zones, neighboring lands, genetic records, artifacts, datable ruins, or cultural sequences that show a clear source. Instead, the evidence offered by believers is usually indirect. Similarities between myths, symbols that are interpreted generously, ruins assigned to Lemuria without cause, or traditions lifted out of context. That is not enough. Human beings are pattern-making creatures. We are very good at noticing resemblance. Sometimes that gift leads to discovery. Sometimes it leads us into a hall of mirrors. Two cultures may use similar symbols because they share ancient contact, but they may also do so because circles, serpents, mountains, floods, suns, and stars are available to nearly every human imagination. Similarity asks for investigation. It does not answer the investigation by itself. This is the point at which many lost world arguments reverse the burden of proof. They begin to say, "You cannot prove it did not exist." But history does not work that way. The larger the claim, the heavier the evidence must be. A continent-sized civilization shaping humanity would not be a faint possibility hiding behind the limits of knowledge. It would be a major fact of human and geological history, demanding major evidence. And the evidence is not there. That does not make every related tradition false in every detail. This is important. Some coastal lands have been lost. Some flood memories may preserve old encounters with changing seas. Some myths may carry fragments of environmental experience, and real archaeology continues to find submerged sites along ancient shorelines, where people once lived before water rose. But those real sunken places are not Lemuria. They are smaller, more local, more human, and often more moving because of it. They do not need to become a vanished supercontinent to matter. A drowned settlement is already a tragedy. A shifting coastline is already a memory. The desire to inflate every submerged trace into Lemuria can actually make the real past harder to see. The same is true of geology. There are submerged plateaus, ridges, and pieces of continental crust beneath the oceans. The Earth is not a simple blue ball with neat land above and empty basins below. But none of that supports the occult or pseudo-historical Lemuria. The existence of hidden crust does not prove a hidden empire. It only proves that the planet's structure is more complicated than a surface map suggests. This distinction is where honest mystery lives. A false mystery says, "Science found something strange, so the legend must be true." An honest mystery says, "Science found something strange and we should understand it on its own terms." Lemuria repeatedly crossed that line. It borrowed real uncertainty, then spent it on unsupported certainty. It borrowed the authority of science when convenient, then abandoned scientific standards when they became inconvenient. In its occult forms, it became immune to correction. In its pseudo-historical forms, it treated absence as concealment. In its political forms, it sometimes turned longing into geography. And yet, the lack of evidence did not destroy it. That may be the most revealing contradiction of all. Lemuria became strongest precisely where it was weakest. Because no confirmed ruins anchored it, no ruin could limit it. Because no real map defined it, it could move from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, to Mount Shasta, to cultural memory. Because no verified civilization stood behind it, each new generation could invent the Lemuria it needed. Evidence would have made Lemuria smaller. Absence made it infinite. That is why disproving it requires more than saying, there are no ruins. Believers can always answer that the ruins are deeper, hidden, spiritual, suppressed, misread, or not meant for ordinary eyes. The myth has learned to use the missing record as protection. But if we are being careful, the conclusion is unavoidable. Lemuria, as a vast lost civilization or recently drowned supercontinent, is not supported by credible archaeology or geology. The real Earth does not behave the way the legend requires. The real human past does not need that missing continent to explain its achievements. The ocean has taken many things. It has taken coastlines, villages, ships, bones, and names. It has taken pieces of human memory and made them difficult to recover. But there is no good reason to believe it took Lemuria. Not the Lemuria of occult books. Not the Pacific motherland of Mu. Not the continent whose absence was asked to explain every mystery at once. What remains is not a drowned empire. It is a story built over a hole in the evidence, and the hole, for many people, became sacred. Chapter 11. Plate tectonics closes the case. The end of Lemuria did not come with a dramatic expedition. No submarine descended through blue darkness and found the final proof missing. No archaeologist stood on a deck holding a broken tablet from a drowned city. No map was unfolded in some archive with the continent crossed out in red ink. The end came more quietly, through a revolution in how the Earth itself was understood. For a long time, the land bridge had been a useful invention. It solved problems without disturbing the continents too much. Similar fossils on separate lands? Imagine a bridge. Related animals divided by an ocean? Imagine a vanished corridor. Strange biological distributions. Add a missing piece of land, then sink it when its work is done. It was convenient, and convenience can feel like truth when better tools are not yet available. But the 20th century slowly gave science a different Earth. Not a fixed planet with stable continents and occasional drowned bridges, but a restless one. Continents were not permanent anchors. They were passengers, moving over immense spans of time on plates of crust. Oceans opened. Seafloors spread. Mountain ranges rose where plates collided. Ancient supercontinents broke apart, and the fragments carried fossils, rocks, climates, and living lineages with them. This new picture did not merely weaken Lemuria. It made Lemuria unnecessary. That is the important point. A theory usually dies most completely when the world no longer needs it. The old Lemurian land bridge had been proposed to explain connections between Madagascar, India, and related life forms. But once scientists understood continental drift and later plate tectonics, those patterns could be explained through deep geological history rather than a recently vanished continent. India had not always been where it is now. Madagascar had not always been isolated in the same way. The southern continents had once belonged to older configurations of land, including the great southern supercontinent Gondwana. Over millions upon millions of years, pieces separated, drifted, collided, and carried traces of their shared past with them. The map had not lost a continent. The map itself had moved. This is a more difficult idea than a land bridge, but it is also more powerful. A land bridge is easy to picture, a road where the sea now lies. Plate tectonics asks us to imagine the planet as a slow machine, moving at rates too small for a human lifetime, but enormous across geological time. It asks us to think in millions of years, to see continents as temporary arrangements, and to accept that the world under our feet is not as still as it feels. In that sense, plate tectonics did more than close the case on Lemuria. It changed the kind of stories the Earth could tell. Under the old model, absence had to be filled with missing land. Under the new model, absence could be explained by motion, separation, extinction, and inheritance. Similar fossils did not require a sunken continent between living shores. They might point to a time when those shores were joined in a very different world. Island species did not require a lost empire beneath the waves. They could be understood through isolation, adaptation, rare dispersal, and the long patience of evolution. The Earth had become stranger than Lemuria, and unlike Lemuria, it left evidence everywhere. The seafloor carried magnetic patterns recording the spread of ocean crust. Rocks on different continents matched older arrangements. Fossils made sense when the continents were reconstructed into earlier positions. Earthquakes and volcanoes traced the edges of plates. Mountain belts became scars of collision. The planet's surface, once treated like a stage set, became an archive of movement. This is where the old lost continent stories began to lose their scientific shelter. A sunken landmass could no longer be placed wherever a puzzle appeared. Geology now had rules. Continents had structure. Oceanic crust had age and behavior. A vast recent continent could not simply collapse beneath the Pacific or Indian Ocean without leaving enormous traces in the rocks, the seafloor, and the history of plate movement. The old freedom to draw land underwater had been taken away. For Lemuria, that was fatal. Not because every old question had been answered in perfect detail. Science rarely works that cleanly. Biogeography remains full of complicated histories, and Madagascar in particular remains one of the most fascinating natural laboratories on Earth. There are still debates about how particular species arrived, diversified, or disappeared, but those debates happen inside a framework that does not require a mystical, drowned continent. The unanswered details became smaller. Lemuria had needed the gaps to be large. This is often how pseudo-history survives after its scientific origin disappears. It retreats from the specific claim into the emotional shape of the claim. When the land bridge is no longer needed, Lemuria becomes a civilization. When geology rejects the continent, Lemuria becomes spiritual. When archaeology does not find ruins, Lemuria becomes hidden, vibrational, symbolic, or suppressed. The myth keeps moving because it is no longer tied to the original problem. But science, in its stricter form, moved on. The lemurs did not need Lemuria. Fossils did not need Lemuria. Human origins did not need Lemuria. The Pacific Islands did not need Mu. Tamil antiquity did not need a sunken supercontinent to have depth and dignity. The real histories were harder, slower, and more fragmented, but they were also more truthful. Plate tectonics did something almost cruel to the myth. It replaced a beautiful error with a better wonder. A vanished continent is dramatic. a moving planet, is profound. The difference is that one asks us to imagine a lost place, while the other asks us to reconsider every place we thought we knew. Madagascar is not merely an island on a map. India is not merely a triangle pressed against Asia. The ocean floor is not emptiness. Every coastline is temporary. Every continent is a chapter, not a final form. Seen that way, the death of Lemuria is not the death of mystery. It is the death of an easy mystery. The harder mystery is real. How did life travel through such deep time? How did isolation create such strange animals? How did continents carry ancient traces across the globe like torn pages from an older book? How can something as solid as land be part of a motion too slow to feel and too vast to deny? Those questions do not need occult races or golden cities. They are already large enough. Lemuria was born because scientists once tried to explain a pattern without knowing the full movement of the earth. That origin deserves a certain sympathy. It was not stupidity. It was an answer made before the better answer had arrived. But once the better answer did arrive, the old continent had no scientific ground left beneath it. The land bridge sank, not into the sea, but into the history of discarded ideas. And yet, even discarded ideas leave fossils of their own. Lemuria remains as a reminder of a moment when science stood at the edge of knowledge and drew a continent into the unknown. It reminds us that uncertainty can be fertile, but also dangerous. It can lead to discovery, or it can become a home for whatever people wish were true. Plate tectonics closed the geological case, but it could not erase the longing that had gathered around the name. Chapter 12. The Real Sunken Worlds. Here is where the story becomes more interesting than a simple dismissal. Because hidden land does exist beneath the sea. Not Lemuria as the occult writers imagined it. Not Mu, the Pacific motherland of men. Not a vanished empire with temples and tablets, erased overnight by catastrophe. But real fragments of continental crust do lie under ocean water, and their existence can make the old legends feel, at first glance, as if they have found a second life. This is the dangerous moment in any mystery. A myth makes an extravagant claim. Science later discovers something superficially similar. And suddenly, the myth reaches forward, trying to borrow the discovery as evidence. So we need to move carefully. One of the most famous examples is Zealandia. For a long time, people knew New Zealand and New Caledonia as islands, not as the visible high points of a much larger submerged continental region. But geological work has shown that they are part of an enormous area of continental crust, most of it lying beneath the Southwest Pacific. That sounds, if heard carelessly, like the opening line of a lost continent documentary, a continent beneath the Pacific. But Zealandia is not Lemuria. It did not sink in the recent human past as a populated empire. It is not a drowned motherland remembered by survivors. It is a geological body shaped over immense time, thinned, submerged, broken, and studied through rocks, seafloor mapping, gravity data, and tectonic history. Its story belongs to the movement of plates and the long breakup of ancient landmasses, not to a sudden civilizational apocalypse. The difference is not small. It is the difference between geology and legend. Zealandia is real precisely because it can be tested. Its rocks have composition. Its crust has thickness. Its boundaries can be argued over by specialists using evidence. It becomes more fascinating the more specific it gets. Lemuria, by contrast, often becomes less specific whenever evidence is requested. That contrast matters. There is another example closer to the original Indian Ocean setting: Mauritius. Researchers have identified evidence suggesting that fragments of ancient continental crust exist beneath parts of the Indian Ocean region, associated with the breakup of older landmasses. Some of this evidence has been discussed in relation to Mauritius and surrounding areas. Again, one can almost hear the old myth stirring: a lost piece of continent near the Indian Ocean, a hidden fragment beneath volcanic islands. Was Lemuria real after all? No, not in the way the legend needs. A fragment of ancient crust is not a lost civilization. It is not a bridge walked by lemurs in the form Sclater imagined, and it is certainly not proof of root races, Pacific empires, or survivors under mountains. Mauritius is a geological clue, not an occult homeland. It may help scientists reconstruct the ancient arrangement and breakup of continents, but it does not resurrect the pseudo-historical Lemuria. This is where language can mislead us. The phrase "lost continent" is too dramatic for its own good. In popular speech, it suggests something whole, inhabited, remembered, and destroyed. In geology, what is lost may mean submerged, fragmented, stretched, buried under lava, or no longer visible on the surface as dry land. The drama is different, slower, less cinematic perhaps, but far more real. A microcontinent does not need a final night of thunder and fire. It can disappear from the surface through processes that take tens of millions of years. That timescale changes everything. Human myths prefer catastrophe because catastrophe has shape. There is a before, a moment of destruction, and an after. A city stands, the sea rises, the people flee, the memory survives. Geological history is less theatrical. It grinds, it stretches, it lowers, it buries. It leaves partial signatures in minerals and crustal structures. Its disasters are real, but they do not always arrive with the clean moral drama of a legend. This is why real submerged worlds can feel strangely unsatisfying to people who want Lemuria to be true. They are too old, too broken, too impersonal. They do not flatter human importance. They do not say that civilization began there. They do not offer secret wisdom. They do not place us at the center of the ocean's memory. But that is exactly why they are worth respecting. The real sunken worlds remind us that the earth does hide things, but not always the things we wish it hid. Beneath the oceans are ridges, plateaus, drowned shelves, ancient crustal fragments, volcanic provinces, trenches, scars of collision, and landscapes no human eye saw when they were formed. The planet is full of concealed history. It simply does not organize that history around our myths. There are also real human worlds drowned by changing seas. During and after the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically as glaciers melted. Coastlines shifted. Land that once supported animals and people became seabed. Around the world, archaeologists study submerged landscapes where ancient humans may have lived, hunted, traveled, or gathered. These places matter deeply. They are not fantasy. They are part of the human story. But again, scale is everything. A drowned coastline is not Lemuria. A submerged settlement is not Mu. A lost shelf is not proof of a continent-sized civilization. The existence of real sunken places should make us more precise, not less. This may be the most honest way to handle the old myth. We do not need to say, "The ocean hides nothing." That would be false. The ocean hides almost everything. It covers mountains, valleys, wrecks, bones, tools, and geological records older than human language. It preserves some things and destroys others. It is not empty. But mystery is not permission. The fact that the sea is vast does not mean every story placed beneath it becomes plausible. The fact that continental fragments exist does not mean any lost continent myth can claim them as ancestors. Real geology should not be treated as a costume for old fantasies. And yet, there is a strange comfort here. Lemuria was wrong, but its first instinct was not entirely foolish. The map really was incomplete. The seafloor really did hold unknown structures. Continents really had stranger histories than 19th century scholars understood. The error was in imagining the wrong kind of hidden land, for the wrong reasons, on the wrong timescale. Science did not reveal Lemuria. It revealed something better. An Earth more restless, more ancient, and more intricate than the myth could manage. Zealandia and Mauritius do not prove the lost continent. They explain why the idea of hidden land remains so tempting. They show that beneath the smooth blue surface of a map, there are buried chapters, but those chapters are written in crust, minerals, magnetism, and time, not in the ruins of a vanished mother civilization. So the sea did give something back, not Lemuria. Something older. Chapter 13. Why the myth refused to sink. Once science no longer needed Lemuria, one might expect the name to fade. It should have become a historical curiosity, a discarded 19th century proposal filed beside other old ideas that helped for a while and then failed. A useful mistake. A reminder of how naturalists tried to solve biological puzzles before the Earth's moving plates were understood. But Lemuria did not behave like a dead theory. It behaved like a myth. And myths survive by serving needs that evidence alone does not satisfy. For the scientist, Lemuria had been a hypothesis. For everyone who came after, it became something more flexible. A lost beginning. A hidden inheritance, a wound beneath the sea. That flexibility is the reason it endured. When one version collapsed, another version took its place. When the Indian Ocean land bridge lost credibility, the Pacific motherland grew larger. When geology refused the sunken continent, occult writers moved the truth into spiritual history. When archaeology found no empire, believers spoke of hidden records, lost wisdom, or survivors beyond ordinary sight. The myth did not sink because it was never anchored in one place for long. But there is a deeper reason. Lemuria offered people the feeling that the world was older in a more intimate way than textbooks allowed. Not simply older by millions of years, or older through fossils and plates and mineral dates, but older with memory, older with intention, older and with a story that included us from the beginning. That is a powerful thing to offer. Modern science can tell us extraordinary truths. It can reveal a planet in motion, species evolving through deep time, continents breaking apart, seas rising and falling. But those truths do not always feel personal. They are vast, and sometimes vastness can feel cold. Lemuria made deep time human-sized. It placed ancestors, civilizations, wisdom, catastrophe, and longing inside the emptiness of the ocean. It gave the abyss a face. That is why lost continents return again and again in modern culture. Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria. Each one answers a similar hunger in a different costume. They suggest that history is incomplete not because evidence is fragile, but because something magnificent has been removed. The missing past is not ordinary. It is grander than the surviving one. This is one of the most seductive ideas human beings have ever invented. It tells us that the best part of the story is hidden, not lost through accident, but waiting beneath the sea, beneath a mountain, inside a symbol, behind a legend, in a book that scholars dismissed too quickly. The attraction is not only mystery, it is hope. If a lost golden age existed once, then perhaps modern life is not the peak of human possibility. Perhaps wisdom was not invented forward, but forgotten backward. That thought can comfort people living through uncertainty. And Lemuria's modern life grew out of uncertain centuries. The 19th and early 20th centuries were filled with disruption. Empire, industrial change, scientific revolution, religious doubt, racial theories, nationalist movements, and new global encounters. Old maps of meaning were being redrawn. People were discovering that the earth was older than Scripture had suggested, that human beings were part of animal history, that ancient cultures were more numerous and complex than many Europeans had assumed. In that unsettled world, Lemuria became a place where confusion could be arranged into a story. For occult seekers, it provided a sacred prehistory. For pseudo-historical writers, it offered a single source behind scattered ancient cultures. For some cultural movements, it became a symbol of lost dignity and deep origin. For modern internet mythology, it became endlessly remixable, part spirituality, part conspiracy, part fantasy map, part alternative archaeology. The internet did not create Lemuria, but it gave the myth a new ocean to cross. Online, ideas do not need strong evidence to travel. They need emotional shape, visual appeal, and the promise that ordinary explanations are incomplete. Lemuria has all three. A drowned continent is easy to picture. A hidden civilization is easy to desire. A suppressed ancient truth is easy to share. And because Lemuria's details were never stable, it adapted perfectly to the digital age. It could be a spiritual frequency, an ancient race, a Pacific empire, a memory of Tamil lands, a lost civilization connected to crystals, or a clue hidden in ruins. Contradiction did not weaken it for many believers. Contradiction made it feel expansive. That is a warning sign. When a claim can mean almost anything, it becomes very difficult to test. And when it becomes difficult to test, it can start to feel profound merely because it cannot be pinned down. But vagueness is not depth. A fog may look mysterious, but it is still fog. Still, the people drawn to Lemuria are not all seeking the same thing. Some are looking for wonder, some for identity, some for spiritual belonging, some for a past that feels less fractured than the present. Some simply enjoy the romance of the impossible. It would be lazy to reduce all of them to gullibility. A myth can be false and still reveal real needs. That is the strange dignity of Lemuria's afterlife. Its geography fails, but its emotional map is accurate. Human beings do long for origin. We do look at the sea and imagine what it has taken. We do suspect, sometimes correctly, that official histories have ignored certain voices, especially those outside centers of power. We do want the past to contain meanings that have not yet been recovered. The mistake is not longing. The mistake is allowing longing to impersonate evidence. That distinction runs through the whole story. There are real submerged landscapes. There are real cultural memories of floods and coastal loss. There are real histories of colonial distortion. There are real mysteries in human migration and ancient civilization. Lemuria often attaches itself to those real things, then stretches them beyond what they can bear. It turns partial truths into total explanations. And total explanations are dangerous because they leave little room for the living complexity of history. They make many peoples into fragments of one vanished source. They make local traditions into clues for an outside theory. They make absence more important than presence. The imagined continent becomes so large that it overshadows the real worlds around it. Perhaps this is why Lemuria refused to sink. It was never really about land. It was about a desire for hidden continuity, a belief that beneath broken history there is a whole history. Beneath scattered cultures, a mother culture. Beneath modern confusion, an ancient order. Beneath the sea, a beginning that was taken from us. Science can answer whether that continent existed. It cannot, by itself, remove the ache that made people imagine it. So Lemuria remains, not as a place on Earth, but as a recurring shape in the human mind. A continent made of need. It rises whenever the past feels too incomplete, whenever the ocean looks too wide, whenever people suspect that what is missing must be more meaningful than what survived. The myth refused to sink because it was built from something lighter than stone and harder to destroy than evidence. It was built from longing. Chapter 14. The continent beneath the story. In the end, Lemuria was not the continent people hoped it would be. It was not a lost Pacific empire waiting beneath the water, its towers intact in the dark. It was not the motherland of all civilization, erased in a single night, and remembered only through scattered symbols. It was not a hidden city under Mount Shasta, nor a geological secret that modern science was too stubborn to admit. But it was never nothing. That is the part worth holding on to. Lemuria began as a serious attempt to solve a real scientific puzzle. Philip Sclater looked at the distribution of lemurs and related animals and proposed a vanished land where the evidence seemed to leave a gap. He was wrong, but he was wrong in a way that belonged to his time. Before plate tectonics, before the moving earth had been fully understood, a missing bridge could look like a reasonable answer. Then the answer escaped the question. It passed from zoology into human origins, from human origins into occult prehistory, from occult books into Pacific fantasies, from Pacific fantasies into mountains, spiritual movements, internet lore, and cultural memory. Each transformation tells us less about the physical earth and more about the people trying to read it. That is why Lemuria matters. A false continent can still leave a real historical trace. It shows how science, when incomplete, can accidentally give myth a doorway. It shows how spiritual hunger can turn speculation into sacred geography. It shows how colonial uncertainty, racial thinking, cultural pride, and the ache for origins can gather around a single name until that name becomes larger than its evidence. The ocean did not give back Lemuria because Lemuria was never there in the way the legends claimed. But the story did give something back. It revealed the way human beings treat absence. We do not leave empty spaces alone for long. We name them. We draw coastlines around them. We imagine ancestors there, wisdom there, ruins there, a beginning there. Sometimes this impulse leads to discovery. Sometimes it leads to distortion. The difference lies in whether we allow evidence to correct desire. The real Earth is already extraordinary enough. Continents move, seafloors spread, coastlines drown, ancient crust hides beneath oceans. Human beings crossed impossible distances without needing a vanished supercontinent beneath their feet. Cultures rose in many places, not because they inherited one secret source, but because human intelligence is not rare. It appears wherever people face the world and learn how to live inside it. That truth is less tidy than Lemuria. It is also more generous. It gives dignity back to the real navigators of the Pacific, the real communities of Madagascar, the real histories of Tamil memory, the real scientists who corrected old mistakes, and the real submerged landscapes that archaeology continues to study with patience rather than fantasy. So the answer to the first question is clear. Lemuria was not a lost Pacific civilization waiting to be found. But the second question is more interesting. Why did it survive? Because people needed a place for their longing. They needed the sea to be more than water. They needed the past to be deeper than the archive, older than the ruin, more intimate than the fossil. They wanted to believe that what was missing had meaning. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Mysteries do not only tell us what we do not know about the world. Sometimes they tell us what we are unwilling to lose about ourselves. Lemuria sank as science. It rose again as myth. And beneath that myth, not under the Pacific, not beneath a mountain, but under the surface of the story, we find something unmistakably human. The hope that somewhere, hidden by distance and time, there is a forgotten beginning still waiting to explain us. There was no continent. There was only the need for one.